Well, would you look at that? I'm talking about horror again, but this time video games. Horror games have existed for a long time, since the 1970s, and as time went on and graphics became better and better, we would see the rise of the most famous horror game franchises to date. Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Dead Space, all of which were praised due to their settings and stories, and, most notably, their monsters. Nemesis, Pyramid Head, the Necromorphs, some of the most iconic faces in gaming, not just in horror. AAA horror games would come to dominate the horror scene for years until the rise of the indie game. The popularization of games such as Cry of Fear. I really wish I was recording my mic because oh my fucking god! Amnesia, The Dark Descent, and Five Nights at Freddy's would prove that indie horror could outperform mainstream even if they were on smaller budgets with smaller teams. At around the same time of the rise of the indie horror games were sandbox survival games such as Minecraft and Terraria. In Minecraft, sometimes when you're mining deep in caves, a sound will play. The sound is only meant to keep the player on edge, but sometimes the most terrifying thing out of them all is when there's a sound when there shouldn't be. As indie horror and survival sandbox, two completely different genres, became more popular, at some point or another they began to intertwine and gave birth to a new type of horror game, the survival horror game. Not survival horror like Resident Evil where resources are scarce and enemies are tanks, but survival in the sense that you are deprived of almost everything that makes you comfortable. Food, water, shelter. Anything you see around you is gone. You're dropped into a place where you're a stranger, and you're not welcome. I want you to imagine this. Your plane crashes in a remote peninsula. You don't know where you are. You don't know why the plane went down. Everyone is dead. Help is not coming. It already sounds like quite the predicament, doesn't it? Now I want you to imagine this. Your son is right next to you. Same situation. The plane goes down. When the plane hits the ground, you wake up and see a red figure picking your son up and taking him away. Who the hell is he? You're probably wondering. What does he want with my son? When you come to, you're alone, surrounded by nothing but death and tragedy. Now I want you to imagine one more thing. The peninsula you've been deserted on. It's not empty. You're not alone. That is the setup to The Forest, an indie sandbox survival horror game that began development in 2013 by Endnight Games. The premise is simple. Plane goes down, survive, find your son. But once you start getting into things and exploring the peninsula, you begin to realize that things aren't at all what they seem. There's so much more to this place than just tribes of cannibalistic mutants. There's a whole other world below the depths. I'd like to take you with me and explore these depths. Welcome to The Forest. In The Forest, you play as Eric LeBlanc, a celebrity survival expert. While on a trip with your son, Timmy LeBlanc, your plane experiences incredible amounts of turbulence, causing it to crash into a remote peninsula in Canada. Now, it's not outright stated that the peninsula is located in Canada, but there are Canadian geese and boreal forests, which is a biome native to Canada. And the last name LeBlanc is French, with almost a third of Canada's population being able to speak both English and French. Plus, the developers, Endnight, are based in Vancouver, Canada. When you first begin exploring the peninsula, there's nothing but woods for what seems like forever, but once you climb over a hill, you get a full scope of where you've been dropped. Welcome to your hell. Better get a camp made quick because that sun's going down and the locals aren't privy to outsiders. That's better. Now that we've gotten nice and comfortable, allow me to explain the topography of the peninsula. To the north you have a mountain that secludes the peninsula from the mainland, keeping those curious away unless they go by boat or plane. Further south you have the forest itself, with the most dense areas being just south of the mountain past the basin. To the east you have the plateau and plains, known affectionately as the fertile lands due to the abundance of wildlife and berries. This is known as the best place to set up a base, as food is easily accessible and you won't see as many enemies around here. The peninsula has small islands surrounding it. Not all of them hold anything special, but those that do are guarded by less than friendly fauna. And in the middle of the peninsula we have the The peninsula is a large area and navigating it can be tricky at times, but luckily the mountains will always be to the north, so if you get to a high enough vantage point, you'll never be lost. Dotting the peninsula everywhere will be small villages made of sticks. Surrounding these villages will be effigies, mostly decapitated heads stuck on sticks. Sometimes with their tongues intertwined, sometimes there'll be a camera stuck in their mouths. What kind of sick, demented person would do such a thing? Oh. Them. The peninsula isn't completely uninhabited. Surviving in the forests of the peninsula are clans of tribals, cannibals. They'll eat people and use the remains as weapons or decoration. They're almost completely animalistic, living almost purely off their instincts. But not always. The tribes of the peninsula do have a loose form of hierarchy, meaning that they do understand power structure to some degree. Their hierarchy, however, does seem to be based off strength, since cannibals with more advanced markings or clothing items tend to be more powerful than the dirty cannibals running on all fours. One thing you'll notice is that cannibals like to hoard items like pictures, sodas, suitcases from planes, and for some reason, red paint. You'll notice that around some villages are holes, entrances. They lead down to the peninsula's extensive cave system, but before we do any spelunking, I want to point out a few interesting things on and around the peninsula itself. If you manage to be fortunate enough to get a spawn on the southern tip of the peninsula, you'll be right next to the beach, and from there, you can see a yacht. The yacht's a unique location, as it can be used as a first night base for some, and others, an interesting piece of lore. On the shore, there's a grave, and on the grave, there's a cassette tape and a Polaroid. It's a picture of the yacht for some reason. Let's take a swim. On the yacht itself, you'll find another Polaroid, this time of a teddy bear. You can find this bear down in the cabin with a captain hat on. In the teddy bear's lap is another Polaroid, this time depicting some sort of multi-legged monster. Whatever it is, it does not look natural. On the table, you'll find some food, half-eaten, and a milk carton. The back of the carton has a missing child portrait, named Zachary. Near the back of the yacht is a door, but it's locked. To the left is a picture of a unicorn made by a child, Megan Cross. Sometimes when you're passing by the yacht, you may see a figure standing on it, watching you. Following the beach north, you'll find a couple of shipping containers beached on the shore. Inside you'll find mostly nothing, but there are some things. A cargo manifest, some sheets of glass and motherboards, which you can use to grate bombs. On the side of the containers is a logo for Sahara Therapeutics. Moving on, further north in the mountains, you can find the cockpit to the plane that you crashed in. Inside, you can find a flare gun and a magazine, detailing that Eric LeBlanc's wife had died in an accident. Scattered around the peninsula are various campsites. Some have very simple canvas tents, others have more modern tents. It can be assumed that the modern tents were left by hikers, oblivious to the dangers that the peninsula held, but the canvas tents have a different story to tell. These are some of the more interesting locations outside of cannibal villages. There honestly isn't much to say about the surface. From a bird's eye view, you'd assume it's just another remote location. But if the surface is a living nightmare, then below is hell itself. Dotted all over the peninsula are various cave entrances. Some are cracks in walls, some are rock-covered holes, and one is... we'll get to that in due time. Chances are, during your first cave exploration, you stumbled on the entrance by accident and curiosity got the better of you. What's the worst that could happen? Once inside, the solitude, the silence, the darkness. It all hits you at once. Your better judgment is probably telling you to go back into the safety of the light, but you can't. You need answers. You need to find your son. Only one way to go. Down and down we go. Maybe you got lucky on your first spelunking adventure and entered a cave with minimal enemies and good loot. The cave that the largest cannibal village in the game is built around, for example, only holds 3 mutants and has the best axe in the game, the modern axe. Alongside the modern axe is a VHS tape, The Lost Children of the Peninsula, tons of dynamite and arrows, and an autopsy report for Jessica Cross. The only other Cross we know of so far is Megan Cross, so it can be safe to assume that Jessica is Megan's mother. Or was. This won't be the last time we hear about Megan or Jessica Cross. Around the caves, you can find a ton of wooden barricades. Sometimes they'll have crosses nailed onto them. Now the question is, were they built to keep people out, or keep something in? The answer is both. Spend enough time in caves and you'll discover the horrors living just below the dirt. The mutants. Creatures beyond our comprehension with a taste for human flesh. Demons straight from the darkest pits of hell. Only we're not in hell. The moment you broke open those barricades, you let them out. Now that there's nothing keeping them down in the caves that held them for generations, they're free to roam the surface. Nowhere is safe. Now what I've just described is the basics of the forest. If you've been following the game for some time, then you already know about the cannibals and creepy mutants in the cave system, the bare bones. But there's a whole other story taking place here that we don't see, and if you're not paying attention, you might miss it. Where to start is kind of difficult, but if you ask me, I feel like we should start with the most basic of these, the main story. As you explore the peninsula and go cave diving, you'll find better and better equipment, including a climbing axe or a breather, more modern equipment such as bows, and overall better weapons. At some point in your adventures, you'll stumble upon a picture of a cave. None of the other caves have pictures, so what's the importance of this one? Turns out this cave is on the western shore of the peninsula, close to the shipping containers. You'll stumble across a multi-armed mutant in a heap of bodies. Kill the mutant and take a look around. In the back end of the pile, there's a keycard, belonging to someone employed by Sahara Therapeutics, the company that the shipping container mentioned earlier. Strange, isn't it? What's an employee of a company like that doing here? Not only in the peninsula, but in a massive pile of dead bodies. And what's with the keycard? What does it unlock? With the keycard on you, you continue exploring the peninsula, searching for a reason why the keycard exists. Your answers lie in the sinkhole. The sinkhole is, well, exactly what it sounds like, a massive crater in the middle of the peninsula. But there's almost no way to the bottom without climbing. You could be an absolute lunatic and jump to the bottom, but what good are you to me if you're dead? Nearby is a cave on a land bridge that'll take you to the bottom. You'll notice that at the bottom of the sinkhole are large, rigid black doors. They don't look like any modern architecture. There's a handful more of these doors operated by a pressure plate system until you finally arrive at the bottom of the sinkhole. At the bottom, you'll find yourself a brand new weapon, the machete, and a downed helicopter. At the center of the sinkhole is a pool of water with a cave entrance in the middle. The cave itself is fairly straightforward. It's just one continuous line. There's more of these black doors and pillars. Just who built these? And then you see it. A door, locked by a keycard. Once you open the door, you're greeted by a long, red corridor. Guess that explains all the red paint. The deeper you go, the more unsettling the things are. In one room, there's what seems to be a borderline shrine dedicated to a little girl. Picking up one of the pictures, we see it's an email from Jessica Cross to who we can assume is her ex-husband. The girl in the picture is Megan Cross. Another peculiar thing around here is under the floors, tucked away to the side, is what seems to be a room for a child. It's clearly lived in, but by who? Once we emerge from the floor, we're brought into what was probably a really nice cafeteria before whatever disaster transpired. Here you can take a break, get a coffee. You'll actually get an achievement if you do. Once we're done, it's back into the vents. Through the vents, we're dropped into what looks like a hospital. There's markers, toys, dolls, and children's books everywhere, and the decor on the walls looks like that you'd see in a daycare. The further in we go, we see a line of rooms with giant windows in them, labeled observation rooms. The thing is, they're all decorated to be kids' rooms. There's toys and letter blocks and beds that clearly belong to children that can't be more than 6 or 7 years old. Observation room A is empty, with the glass broken, presumably from the inside. Observation room B is also empty, but the glass is intact. This room has 3 beds instead of 1. Observation room C has a few interesting things to note. There's 4 dead mutants and 2 beds. One of them, with the name John written on it, has some thing lying on it. It's not like any other mutant we've seen so far. Observation room D is once again empty, with 2 beds in it. Behind the room and down the hall, we see another multi-armed mutant standing in front of the observation rooms. Observation room E has its glass broken. I think it's safe to assume that these mutants we're seeing in this sterile, lab-like environment broke out of these observation rooms, but if that's the case, then are the mutants children? Observation room F has another multi-arms mutant, but it's dead and close to the glass, indicating it may have tried to escape. G is empty with a mutant dead in the window. You'll notice on the bed there's a Bible. Observation room H is... moving on. Down the hall is another entrance that leads up to the vent system. I'd like to note that there's a window that holds a handful of push carts with each one having one of the mutant babies on them. What were they being used for? I have no clue. Once we're dropped into this next room, we finally get some answers. This laboratory was built by Sahara Therapeutics and, as seen in Orientation Slideshow 2, supposedly to find the secrets to extending human life through something called the Jericho Project. And it's here we finally get the answer to who Megan's father is. Dr. Matthew Cross. Matthew seems to be the one in charge of the Jericho Project and, as a result, responsible for whatever happened that caused the lab to become abandoned. It's in this slideshow we're properly introduced to the creatures we've seen in the caves. Though we don't know their true names, Sahara Therapeutics refers to them as Subjects 37B5, nicknamed Virginia, and Subject 82C6, nicknamed Armsy. Something of note here is that Matthew Cross attributes the growth of multiple limbs as something called a sibling anomaly. As for what sibling anomaly means, I'm not sure, but I do have a theory later that may help shed some light. I think the most disturbing thing here is the implication that these weren't just at one point people, but based on the observation rooms we took a stroll through, it can be safe to assume that these things were children. A map of this facility shows that it's quite large, with 6 levels and an observation deck at the top of the mountain. The fact that this was hiding right above you, and you never knew. Exiting this presentation room, we can see a workspace-like area. On the whiteboard is a peculiar looking sketch of some type of monolith. These sketches appear in other areas too. What's so important about this thing? Well, through a couple more rooms, we'll soon learn why. Because there it is. Hooked up by wires and tubes to some kind of medical bed is a large black stone monument. With someone inside. I won't speak for this segment, because I want you to just watch it for yourself. Not a single word is spoken, but the weight of the scene speaks for itself. The music sets the tone perfectly, starting slow and melancholy, and as the synth grows, hope begins to spark. There might still be a chance, but not without a sample. Not without a sacrifice. On the ground is that same unicorn drawn by Megan Cross on the yacht, and small, bloody footprints leading out of the room. And in the adjacent room is him, the Red Man, Matthew Cross. Daddy's dead. Stabbed in his eyes, mouth, head, and neck by crayons. By Megan Cross. Next to his corpse is a printer with an email that Matthew printed out. We believe the device may be able to bring down a plane. Following the bloody footprints brings us deeper and deeper into the facility, until we're met with a large atrium. The footprints continue, leading towards the end of it. There's a small, pale girl sitting at the very end, playing. It's Megan. Again, not a single word is spoken, but there doesn't need to be. She knows you. She knows you're here for Timmy. She knows you're here to kill her. Before he can, she begins convulsing horrifically, and out of her mouth emerge even more limbs. You're gonna have to take her down to even get a chance at saving Timmy. This boss fight is intense, and the stakes are high, and the music is just incredible. It might be one of my favorite boss fights in gaming, to be completely honest. It's time. Time to put everything that you've learned to the test. Use every skill that you've earned. It's time for you to use every weapon in your disposal. It's time to end this. Once it's done and Megan's been subdued, you can return back to Timmy, only to realize you need a live sample. Megan drops a key card, a golden one, and this will take you out into a cave system. In the caves, we can see entire circles of old corpses reaching out to something or crawling away. But to and from what? Eventually, you'll find an elevator. Ride it to the top, and you'll be welcomed to the facility's observation deck. You can see the entire peninsula from up here. And it's in here you'll meet the cause of your suffering. A large, sphere-shaped artifact, similar in architecture to the obelisk we saw earlier. This is the device Cross-stated could down a plane, and now we're met with a choice. Before we use a control panel, on it, we see multiple suitable samples to resurrect Timmy, aged 4, 7, and 9. Thomas, Kevin, and Sally. Tucked off to the side is an emergency shutdown monitor. Now here comes the moral debate. An Airbus A320, the plane that the one in the Forest is modeled after, can seat up to 180 people. The plane Eric and Timmy went down on held 45 according to the passenger manifest. So here's the question. Do you condemn possibly 180 people to their deaths to save your child? What gives you that authority? And is the pain, suffering, and death of those people worth the life of one person? It's a very riveting moral question, but you came all this way, murdered countless cannibals, and now a child. There's no going back. We don't see what happens. We cut to a year later, where Eric and Timmy have been invited onto a talk show to talk about Eric's latest book, detailing the horrors that they went through in exposing Sahara Therapeutics for their inhumane experiments. The host challenges Eric to a woodchopping competition, which he at first declines, but after the audience eggs him on, he accepts and begins to chop. Behind him, however, Timmy begins having a seizure similar to the one Megan experienced. Everyone is in a panic, but Eric holds Timmy and he begins to calm down. There's another cut. This time years later, with Timmy as an adult in his apartment. His walls are lined up and down with documents, maps, drawings, and a cross. On the wall facing his bed is a map of an island, labeled Site 2. Timmy's arm begins bulging and mutating, and that's when the credits roll. An absolutely phenomenal ending to an amazing game. And like I said, that's only half the story. Again, there's a whole history we're missing out on that you would never know if you only played the main story. So, let's rewind. All the way back to that plane crash. Yes, you're reading that right. Alongside Eric and Timmy were 43 other passengers, all listed in the passenger manifest. A majority of them were normal civilians, but a hefty chunk of them were on a tennis team, and you can find tennis balls and a tennis racket in caves, and even a tennis outfit. This is one of the most surface level observations we can make, but there's another group I'd like to point out to you. In the manifest, we can see there's 2 people with the last name Higashi and 1 with the last name Yui. They're Japanese names, for sure. But they weren't just your average tourists. If you enter a cave near the Fertile Lands, you can find the 3 men there with cases of watches and money, with one of the men being stabbed through his entire body by a katana. This amount of money, watches, and a lethal weapon? These couldn't have been civilians. I mean, what type of civilian takes that many valuables and a weapon on a flight? One of these men's tattoos has been filleted off his body and stretched onto a frame, and if you're at all familiar with Japanese culture, you'll know that over there, tattoos are commonly associated with the Yakuza, an organized crime syndicate. Just what exactly the Yakuza were up to is not known, but their loss is your game. Inside the cave where the modern axe is located, there's a box full of VHS tapes named The Lost Children of the Peninsula, which is assumed to be a documentary describing, well, exactly that, the children who mysteriously go missing in and around the peninsula. Just when exactly the tapes were being produced is unclear, as the game is set in 2010 and VHS tapes began to stop being mass-produced in the West in 2006 after the release of A History in Violence. But they didn't stop being produced in Japan until 2016. There was another film crew on the peninsula, but this time they were creating a feature-length film or even a survival TV series rather than a documentary. They have a script in the camp named Charles the Survival Man. Whatever this was, we'll never know. If you spent any time around the peninsula, I'm sure you've noticed the abundance of crosses and Bibles. This has much religious meaning, as it's the method of execution the Romans used to kill Jesus Christ, and many people see it as a holy symbol. The cannibals seem to have adopted the cross as their own, with some of the highest ranking cannibals wearing them alongside red paint. Why they adopted this is unclear, but we can trace their exposure to the cross as far back as the 1860s, when the Vatican, presumably, sent missionaries to the peninsula, either to begin settling it or convert the local population to Christianity, though the latter is unconfirmed as there's no mention of cannibals above ground from the missionaries. In one of the caves you can find a note left by one of the missionaries, including a drawing of a crucifix and another of the sinkhole. The note is written in Latin and has had a few translations. All of them are pretty incomprehensible, but the most widely agreed transliteration is something along the lines of deformed babies and four-legged women. Crosses don't stop them. There is another sketch somewhere in the cave system, this time of the Virginia. What more than likely happened was the church sent them out to the peninsula in order to scope out the area and convert any locals to Christianity, but instead, they met their deaths in the belly of the beast. If you're exploring the high seas on your raft, sometimes you can come across a floating plank tied by a rope. Following the rope to the bottom leads you to an underwater cave. These caves were added in the last update to the forest and, as a result, have some good late game items and new blueprints, including the glider and tower, turtle shell slides, and a crossbow. Looking around, however, you'll notice a ton of notes with some type of lettering on them. The characters on them are kanji, a form of Japanese writing that uses Chinese characters. There are also crosses here too, as seen in the tower blueprint. There's even a blueprint that allows you to build a cross and church, alongside a crossbow and a picture of a ship. This is, presumably, the one that these sailors were on before becoming stranded. With the crossbow and the ship being a Chinese trade ship, it can be safe to assume that these travelers were Chinese traders. It's a shame how they turned out, but at least they don't have to suffer anymore. Around the peninsula, you may notice certain things that allude to a higher power. There's, of course, the crosses and Bibles scattered all over the peninsula, but there's something more than we may initially think. In one of the caves is a painting of a group of people surrounding a large, red figure. Now, at first you may think this figure is Matthew Cross, as he's the only person we've seen around the peninsula that wears red paint, but that wouldn't explain why the cannibals hold so much reverence for the color red to the point that they would hoard red paint and cloth, or why Cross even paints himself red. Our answer to this may, once again, be deep within the abyss. Remember the doors we found at the bottom of the sinkhole? These obsidian doors, as they've been dubbed, share similar architecture to both the Resurrection Obelisk and the Power Obelisk we saw in the Sahara Lab. There's also a common theme of sacrifice, as for the doors, you need to open them by sacrificing people, placing their skulls into a pedestal that will open the doors, or the Resurrection Obelisk, which requires a live sacrifice in order to resurrect one from the dead. These doors and artifacts may even predate human civilization, but that's pure speculation. Due to the nature of the artifacts found and the fact that these deities no longer exist, the community is fittingly called this person or group of people the Ancient Ones. Again, whether this was an entire race or one person is pure speculation. As they're the ones that created the artifacts, and as a result the cannibals and creepy mutants, the Ancient Ones are revered as gods, and the cannibals' obsession with the color red may imply the Ancient Ones held a red tint to their skin. Another interesting artifact is found only when you unlock the alternate ending to the game. If you decide to not destroy the incoming plane and instead shut down the Power Obelisk, you're allowed to continue playing the game as normal. If you decide to return to the yacht and use your brand new keycard, courtesy of Megan Cross, you can unlock it and find not only a small room that looks like it might have belonged to Megan at some point, but also a strange looking device on the bed. When you hover over it in your inventory, it's labeled as Artifact. If you take this artifact back to the cave you came out of during the alternate ending, you can find another set of sacrifice doors, only this time locked by a key mechanism and not a pressure plate. Insert the key into the pedestal and enter the room. It's a shrine. Dozens of rotting corpses reaching out towards a glowing orb in the middle of a stone circle. This is the real artifact. Whatever it is, it's extremely powerful. The artifact has 3 modes: passive, aggressive, and inactive. Passive is when the artifact is set to blue. Once stabbed into the ground, cannibals and mutants will be less common around the area surrounding the artifact. Setting it to aggressive, however, will attract and enrage them. Be prepared for a fight, because once it's on, it's on.
Fuck you! Oh shit! You're shitting me! Oh, I'm so dead. I'm so dead. I cannot keep up with this thing.
Inactive is pretty self-explanatory. The artifact will be inactive, no shine at all. What's interesting is the way it interacts with the peninsula itself. It only works if it's stabbed into the ground, and even more interesting is how red attracts cannibals. Red is commonly used as a color to symbolize aggression anyway, but the red motif has been seen all throughout the game, so it can't just be a coincidence. Or at least, I don't like to think so. Along with these artifacts, there's a couple of trees that seem to hold much significance to the cannibals. They're larger than any other tree and are on cannibal patrol routes. Just what exactly the trees signify to them is unknown, but it has to tie back to the Ancient Ones. Whoever this Ancient One or these Ancient Ones were, they were incredibly intelligent and powerful, creating artifacts that humans can't even begin to understand how they work. Reviving people from the dead, generating massive energy waves, and even influencing the behavior of the environment. These were likely more than just people, but gods. The missionaries never stood a chance. God was not with them. God does not see the peninsula. It is not part of his kingdom. So, now that we went over the main story and some of the lore surrounding it, I think this is a pretty good point to begin talking about why Sahara Therapeutics was interested in the peninsula in the first place. At some point in the 2000s, Sahara Therapeutics, a pharmaceutical company, bought the peninsula after discovering the creepy mutants. This has to be a recent purchase since we can see that parts of the lab are still under construction in the caves. Now, you're probably wondering, just why exactly is Sahara so interested in the creepy mutants so much to the point that they begin to create them? Well, for that, we need to look at the videotapes. The camcorder is found directly across from the keycard, and with it you can view various tapes you can find around the peninsula. The first is called Megan's Arrival. It is exactly that, documenting Megan Cross's arrival at the Sahara Research Lab via helicopter, most likely by her father. You'll notice in the video she's wearing what looks like an oxygen mask. The second tape, Lunch with Megan, shows Megan in the cafeteria of the Sahara Lab. Nothing too out of the ordinary. Now that we see Megan in clear lighting, we see she's deathly pale. When I first played and saw Megan, I thought she was that pale because of her resurrection, but it seems that's just how she looks. She's also wheelchair bound, which may indicate either her legs aren't functional or her body doesn't have the energy to move them anymore. Tape 3 is called Opening the Artifact. In it, a group of scientists, one accompanied by a child, stand in front of the resurrection obelisk as it opens for the first time in what could possibly be centuries. The fact there's a child there solidifies the fact that children were being used in the Sahara experiments, and based on Megan's appearance, possibly even terminally ill children. As seen in Matthew's presentation, we can see that parents would willingly hand their children over to Sahara, assuming they'd be receiving the utmost care and possibly even a cure to their ailments. This could also be the reason why Matthew was the head of the project. He wanted to find a way to cure Megan. As we've seen before, there's no lengths he won't go to save her. Tape 4 is Side Effects. It's from the perspective of a security camera as a child in a bed begins to convulse violently and seize. These seizures are ones we also saw in Megan and Timmy right before they were about to mutate, so it can be safe to assume that whoever that child was is no longer that child, but one of the mutants. Tape 5 is Armsy Breakout. The scientists gather around an observation room, and we hear the all too familiar calls of an Armsy attempting to break the glass. It succeeds, and anyone in the vicinity is killed, including poor Megan. Tape 6 is Second Artifact Test. In it, we see a group of scientists activating the power obelisk seen at the top of the observation deck for what is presumably the first time, as we can see everyone ducks just before it goes off. And that's all for the tapes. Though short, there's so much we can go off of from here. If we go back to the Jerry's project orientation slideshow, we can see there's an earnings report with 3 statistics: how amiable the Jerry's project will be amongst investors, the amount of parents that are willing to spend money on their children, and the amount lost due to the purchase of the peninsula. The parent statistic further solidifies that these children weren't kidnapped or taken against their will, but were brought here willingly by their parents, under the false pretense that they'd be able to cure their children and extend their lifespans. Why do I say this? Well, it's because creepy mutants live for a long time. As we see in the Latin notes, the Virginias have existed on the peninsula for quite some time. Sahara was more than likely studying the creepy mutants, trying to learn how they were able to live for so long, before discovering the artifacts. Speaking of, let's start on the artifacts, the Resurrection Obelisk and the Power Obelisk. The Resurrection Obelisk is a tall stone monument that has 2 doors at the front. Inside is an array of spikes that point inward with just enough space inside for a person to fit in, albeit not comfortably. But comfort was never the point. As seen in the lab, a deceased individual needs to lay near the obelisk in order for the effects to work. How this worked before Sahara began using a special device hooked to a bed, we're not really sure, but what we do know is that through some supernatural means, the person who lays dead near the obelisk will suddenly revive once someone is sacrificed to the obelisk. But it can't just be any person. As we see in-game, there needs to be specific matches in order for the obelisk to revive someone. Once this criteria is met, the person will be revived but mutated. These mutations can range anywhere from manageable and even controllable to horrific disfigurement. This isn't the only artifact Sahara has in possession. As seen in the observation deck, they also have access to an ovular-shaped device named the Power Obelisk. This artifact has black ribs that contain some form of intense energy. Once this energy is released, it creates a massive EMP wave, taking out any electronics not directly at its center. The blast is so powerful it can drop a plane mid-flight. What such a device was capable of in a time where electricity had not existed yet is almost completely unknown. We have no records going back far enough to know. In Orientation Slideshow 2, we can see that when referring to the growth of multiple limbs, Cross mentions something called a sibling anomaly. Looking up sibling anomaly only brings up one player's concerned question about the concept of the Virginias. With no real explanation to what a sibling anomaly is, we've been kind of left to wonder. I'm sure theories do exist, but I'll share my own for now. You can choose to believe this or not, but this is the best that I could come up with. We see in the observation deck that there's only 3 suitable candidates for Timmy's resurrection, all of which are young children. But it's a plane that can seat almost 180 people. There's a very slim chance that only 3 children were on that flight. Considering they're labeled as the most suitable candidates, the theory I'd like to present is this. Sahara takes children and uses them for the Resurrection Obelisk, that much is clear. But they can't just use any child. As seen in a newspaper clipping, 2 siblings were taken to the peninsula and were not recovered. Siblings. 2 people with the same biological parents that have similar genes to one another. That's why Matthew crossed down the plane so he could take Timmy instead of using any of the other children in the lab to save Megan. The children weren't suitable. The Resurrection Obelisk resurrects even if the sacrifice is not identical to the deceased, sure, but the chance of mutation also goes up due to this factor. Sacrifices with a more similar genetic makeup are less likely to cause unsavory side effects, thus making them siblings. Just for the sake of being comprehensive, I'm going to refer to the sacrifices as siblings. A sibling anomaly more than likely occurs whenever a sibling has a difference in their genetic makeup compared to the deceased, causing a sibling anomaly. Since almost no one person is identical, with the exception of identical twins, there's a near guaranteed chance of a sibling anomaly no matter who is sacrificed. The only way to mitigate the severity of the anomalies is to make sure the siblings are as close of a genetic match as possible. This would explain why some mutants are more grotesque and animalistic than others. The Virginias and Armsies, for example, were created before this concept was understood, but Megan and Timmy were resurrected at a point where Sahara, more specifically Cross, understood this fact. Megan and Timmy were close enough matched to the point that Megan's resurrection was a success with few anomalies found in her until her boss fight. Timmy's resurrection is even more of a success as he managed to survive into adulthood without succumbing to the effects of the sibling anomaly. I know my explanation was a little long-winded and not worded very well, but the basic rundown is the more similar someone is in genetic makeup, the more successful a resurrection will be, and the less likely a sibling anomaly will cause complete mutations such as the creepy mutants. Again, this is just my theory, so if you want to believe something else, you're more than welcome to. Almost central to this narrative of the peninsula, Sahara, and Eric is the Cross family, Matthew, Jessica, and Megan. Though we don't know much about Jessica, we do know quite a bit about Matthew and a little bit about Megan. We're not 100% sure on how the family was before the events of the game, but what we can deduce is that at some point during their marriage, Matthew became abusive towards his family, as seen from a picture made by Megan where she depicts Daddy as a monster. From this, and a fortune that presumably belonged to Jessica Cross, we can also learn that Matthew had brown hair. Not important, but I thought it was neat to add his hair color despite him being bald in the game, more than likely to blend in better with the cannibals. We have no years for any of the events leading up to the Sahara incident, so timing is a little hard to pinpoint, but in the later years of their marriage, Jessica and Matthew had a divorce, where Jessica was given custody of Megan. This would lead to Matthew stalking Jessica and promptly having a restraining order put out against him, but as we know earlier, that didn't stop him. After the restraining order was filed is the fortune I mentioned earlier. How ironic. Matthew's stalking culminated in him murdering and mutilating Jessica, presumably so he could take custody of Megan. Speaking of, it's likely Megan didn't know any of this happened, since if we assume the camcorder belonged to Matthew, we can see she's decently happy being around her father. Sometime during Megan's school years, she contracted a disease that caused her to become terminally ill. Her pale appearance may be partly due to her not being exposed to sunlight, instead being held inside a hospital. As the severity of Megan's illness increased, Matthew had become the head of the Jericho project started by his employer, Sahara Therapeutics. The project's goal was to create a medicine that could both prolong human life and cure deadly illnesses. Matthew saw an opportunity to save his daughter and promptly flew her out to the facility. After learning how the resurrection obelisk works, Sahara began using it to sacrifice and revive children in a ritualistic cycle. These experiments would result in the creation of the creepy mutants we see in the lab, and one day, one of these, an Armsy, escaped, killing a handful of scientists and Megan. Torn apart by grief, Matthew began using the obelisk to try and revive Megan, but was fired from Sahara before he was able to do so. Now here comes an interesting theory that my friend informed me of. There's a theory that the artifact found in the cave under the Sahara lab was used to coordinate attacks by the Ancient Ones. Since Matthew was the one to have the key, as seen on the yacht, we can assume that Matthew not only understood how the artifact worked, but also had easy access to it. The theory goes that Matthew took the artifact, set it to aggressive, and let it sit under the lab, enraging the mutants inside, causing them to escape and luring the cannibals to the lab, attacking anyone inside. Once the task was complete, Matthew set the artifact back to passive so he wouldn't be attacked while he worked. Matthew made his way up to the power obelisk and dropped the plane, kidnapping Timmy and causing Eric to have to go on a wild chase to find him. From there, we know how the crosses ended up. All of this, everything, it was all caused by Matthew Cross's grief and greed. He couldn't stand the thought of his daughter passing away because of his work, so he murdered dozens, possibly even hundreds, children included, in order to save her. And it turns out that his work was not appreciated by Megan. He's nothing but a monster, to us and to her. Okay, we're nearly there. You guys still with me? Great. Now, I know I've said a lot these past 41 minutes, so why don't I give you guys a quick refresher on what we've talked about. I've compiled a nice, concise timeline for us to read and understand how everything fits together. Unknown time, possibly before European colonization. The Ancient Ones create the artifacts, the obsidian doors, and the mutants. Where they went afterwards is a mystery, but their deific reputation among the cannibals imply that they were incredibly intelligent gods, bestowing the gift of immortality to their subjects, as long as a sacrifice was brought. 1810s to 1860s. At some point during the early to mid 1800s, a group of missionaries arrived on the peninsula, sent over by the Vatican. Just what exactly their purpose there is not clear, but it can be assumed they were sent to settle the area and introduce Christianity to the local population. The missionaries discover the mutants, including the babies in Virginia, and even the resurrection obelisk. They have a crisis of faith, worshipping the resurrection obelisk up until their deaths. Mid to late 1900s. Reports of children going missing in and around the peninsula begin to occur. This leads to a news article being written about it in supposedly the 50s or 60s, and a documentary being filmed about it anywhere from the 70s to the 90s. Whether this documentary was released or not is unknown. Mid-2000s to early 2010s. The Cross family is formed and, years later, disbanded following Jessica Cross's divorce of Matthew Cross, an employee of Sahara Therapeutics. Jessica gains custody of their daughter Megan, files a restraining order against Matthew after repeated stalking, and is subsequently murdered by Matthew to obtain full custody of Megan. In the late 2000s, Eric LeBlanc, a celebrity survival expert, has a son, Timmy, and loses his wife a number of years later. After purchasing the peninsula, Sahara Therapeutics discovers the resurrection obelisk and begins experimenting with it, discovering that it has the ability to revive the dead at the cost of their humanity. They begin the Jericho project, and place Matthew Cross, a doctor specializing in pediatric genetics, as the head, and begin using children provided to them by desperate parents in order to learn how the obelisk resurrects people and enhances their lifespan. At some point during the Jericho project's development, Megan Cross became terminally ill, incentivizing Cross to work even harder on the project. Megan is flown out by Cross to the Peninsula lab and later is killed after an Armsy broke out of containment. The loss of his daughter causes Cross to go postal. He attempts to revive her using the obelisk, but is caught and fired by Sahara. As an act of revenge, Cross uses the artifact found under the Sahara lab and uses it to lure the cannibals into the lab, causing everyone inside to be killed in gruesome fashion. Their bodies are dragged out of the lab and into the cave system below to store as food. Cross uses the power obelisk to destroy Coupon Airlines Flight 111 in order to take Timmy LeBlanc. As an added safety measure, Cross shaves his head and paints himself red in order to appear like the Ancient Ones, to ensure the cannibals do not attack him. Eric sets out on a long mission to find Timmy, taking him deep below the peninsula into the Sahara lab. Timmy's sacrificed to the resurrection obelisk to revive Megan, who promptly murders her father in cold blood. Once Eric comes across Timmy's corpse in the obelisk, he's ridden with grief before realizing there's a way to save him. He hooks Timmy up to the obelisk and searches for Megan, finding her in a large atrium. Megan recognizes Eric as Timmy's father and mutates, forcing Eric to kill her. Once dead, he brings her body to the obelisk, but it rejects her body, requiring a live sacrifice. Eric finds his way up to the power obelisk and drops another plane. Though it's not seen, Eric takes one of the children from the flight and uses them to resurrect Timmy. After being rescued, Eric and Timmy return home, where Eric writes a book about his experience on the peninsula and exposes Sahara Therapeutics' Jericho project to the public. Once the book is published, he's invited onto a talk show where he's challenged to a woodchopping competition. During the competition, Timmy begins to mutate but is calmed down. Possibly decades later, Timmy is a fully grown adult and is researching the artifacts that were used to revive him. His research leads him to Site 2. And that is The Forest. A story simple enough to be understood without added context, but with a fully fleshed out history that any lore fanatic will find interesting and dark. When I first played The Forest and learned all of this, I was blown away with how much had been hidden just below the surface. Just like the peninsula itself, on the cover it looks like just a sandbox horror game, but once you start digging deeper and exploring more, you find a place feared by men, not understood by science, and untouched by God. Endnight struck gold with The Forest, and was well worth 4 years in early access before being released. I have hundreds of hours in The Forest, across both PlayStation and PC, proving just how incredible such a simple game can be. Even though I've spoiled quite literally almost everything in the game, for anyone that hasn't played it, I urge you to go play it. It is indie horror at its most terrifying, most simple, most bare bones, and it still gives you an amazing experience that leaves you wanting more. And in 2023, Endnight Games delivered.